A little bit of review about where we've been with determinism and alternative possibilities. Recall that the second premise from the dilemma of determinism said, if determinism is true, then we can never do otherwise than we actually do, hence we don't have free will. And if we don't have free will, then we're not morally responsible for anything we do. So the worry that we've had with determinism is that it rules out our ability to do otherwise. When we look forward at when we're thinking, when we're deliberating about a choice to make and looking forward at the choices we can make, we imagine that there are alternative paths open to us, that either way we could decide which way to go. But the determinism seems to rule out that, or make it seem like that view of our lives is just an illusion, right? That really the past and the laws of nature determine that only one future is really possible. Now, we've considered two versions of the principle of alternative possibilities. So what does it mean to be able to do otherwise than we actually do? There's the incompatibilist version. The incompatibilists say, so remember, incompatibilists, hard determinists, and libertarians, they say in order to be morally responsible, to have free will and be morally responsible for what we do, we have to have this ability, that holding fixed the past, a person must be able to do otherwise at a particular moment when making a decision. So Kane does a nice job of fleshing this out when he talks about, imagine you're thinking about which college you should go to, the University of Colorado or the University of Hawaii. And you're thinking about it, and you have all these reasons which are leading you in one direction. Say you love tropical weather, you've always vacationed in Hawaii, and you know they have great programs, and so you want to go to Hawaii. Kane and other incompatibilists believe that right up until the moment you make the decision, holding fixed all the ways you think about it that make you lean towards Hawaii, it has to be the case that somehow you could be able to go to Colorado, right? Um, and what compatibilists have pointed out is that this doesn't really make much sense, that it almost seems like a magical ability, that holding fixed all your reasoning and all the way you're thinking about something and all the neurons firing in your brain the way they're firing when you make a decision, that somehow you could be able to have gone the other way than you did. That seems almost incoherent. So they said, well, we agree that you need this ability to do otherwise. And they said it's just a little different than you incompatibilists think about it. The compatibilists say, in order to be free and morally responsible, one must be able to do otherwise if one had wanted to do otherwise. And they called this the conditional analysis of the ability to do otherwise, or the conditional analysis of the principle of alternative possibilities. So instead of it holding fixed all the ways you were thinking about it and the way your neurons were, for a compatibilist, they say that doesn't make sense. All that's needed for freedom and responsibility is, had you thought about it differently, so had the past been a little bit different and you thought about it differently, if nobody was preventing you, or no overwhelming desire was preventing you from going the other way, then that's enough to be free. So freedom is contrasted with constraint, as Ayer said. Now, the philosopher we're going to be talking about today, Harry Frankfurt, he came along and said, actually, you know what? You don't need alternative possibilities in any sense in order to be in order to be free and morally responsible. And note what he's doing if he can build that argument. If he says you don't need alternative possibilities in any sense to be morally responsible, then determinism isn't a worry. If that is the only worry about determinism, is alternative possibilities. So Frankfurt's article that we're going to be talking about today changed the game. Before Frankfurt wrote his piece, about 2/3 of philosophers were hard determinists. After he wrote this piece, about 2/3 of philosophers were compatibilists. So a sea change in the literature on this topic. And here's the guy, Harry Frankfurt, still alive, professor emeritus of philosophy at Princeton. He holds that alternative possibilities are not required at all for moral responsibility. So if you're a nerd about free will like I am, then this is exciting stuff. So today we're going to be zooming in on alternative possibilities and moral responsibility. So Frankfurt's strategy is he's going to develop a counterexample to the principle of alternative possibilities. So before we get to that, because that's pretty difficult technical philosophy stuff, let's talk about how you create a counterexample in the first place. So consider a principle like this. If a team wins the AFC West, then that team goes on to win the Super Bowl. So what would a counterexample to that look like? Well, you'd have to find a team where the first part, the if part of that if-then statement was true, but the then part was false. So you'd have to find a team that won the AFC West that didn't go on to win the Super Bowl. And it's been a while since I've followed football, but there are plenty of examples of teams that won the AFC West, did not go on to win the Super Bowl. So what we're looking for a counterexample, the if part true, the then part false. So then let's look at the principle of alternative possibilities. It says, if someone is morally responsible for some action, then that person had alternative possibilities open to them. So what would a counterexample to this principle look like? Well, the if part would have to be true. They would have to be morally responsible for their action, but the then part would have to be false. So it would have to be false that the person had alternative possibilities. And you can flip this around too. So if a person had alternative possibilities, if a person did not have alternative possibilities, then they were not morally responsible for their action. And so to find the counterexample to that, we would need to find an example where somebody did not have alternative possibilities, but they were morally responsible for their behavior still. So Frankfurt says he has such an example, and to people following the free will debate up to Frankfurt, that just seems like magic. So let's see if he can produce such an example. So he produces what have been called Frankfurt cases ever since, and he comes up with this thought experiment that he's going to produce multiple iterations of. And the example goes something like this. Somebody, he says, calls him Jones, decides for reasons of his own to do something. And we're going to fill that in here, to steal a candy bar. So Jones decides for reasons of his own to steal a candy bar. Then, implausibly in the real world, but in thought experiment world, he can stipulate this. Right when he's about to steal the candy bar, someone comes along and threatens Jones, trying to make him steal a candy bar. We're going to fill that in. Imagine somebody comes along, holds a gun to Jones's head and says, if you don't steal this candy bar, then I'm going to shoot you in the head. Jones goes on to steal the candy bar. So Frankfurt's going to keep those facts about these 4 iterations of these Frankfurt cases the same. The differences are going to be what actually brings about Jones's action. So on some versions, it'll be Jones's initial desire that will bring him to steal the candy bar. On some versions, it will be the threat that makes Jones steal the candy bar. And what our feeling is about these cases, Frankfurt says, will depend on what actually does the work in bringing Jones to steal the candy bar, not whether he had, not only whether he had alternative possibilities. So let's get into some of these variations. All right. So on the first variation of this case, Jones the first, Frankfurt says, imagine Jones walks into a store planning to steal a candy bar. So Jones goes into the store and he decides he's going to steal a candy bar. Somebody comes up, points a gun at Jones and says, you're going to steal this candy bar. I'm going to shoot you in the face. Now, Frankfurt says of case one, Jones the first is not a reasonable man. So he is the kind of person who, once he's decided to do something, he's going to do it regardless of what anybody says about it. So if somebody were to say to Jones when he was about to steal the candy bar, I'm going to shoot you if you do steal this candy bar, Jones the first would still go steal the candy bar, right? Anything he sets his mind to, he's going to do. So Jones the first, who's not reasonable, walks into a store, says, I'm going to steal a candy bar. And of course, he's the type of person who nobody can change his mind. Somebody comes up to him and says, I'm going to shoot you if you don't steal the candy bar. Jones the first is like, whatever, man. Like, I don't care. I do what I want. I'm going to steal this candy bar. Why? Because I want to steal this candy bar, and I don't care what you say about it. So Frankfurt asks, does Jones the first have alternative possibilities? In other words, could Jones the first have ended up not stealing the candy bar? And the answer is yes. Had Jones the first decided that he wouldn't steal the candy bar, then he wouldn't steal the candy bar. He'd get shot instead of stealing the candy bar. So did he have alternative possibilities open to him on this story? Yes, he did. Now, is Jones the first morally responsible for stealing the candy bar? I think we should say, yes, he is morally responsible. Why? Because what made him act, the only thing that made him act, was his desire to steal the candy bar. It's almost as if that threat never happened. Jones the first just cannot be coerced. He's the kind of person who decides something and then does it. So he's has alternative possibilities, morally responsible for his action. Now, one thing to note here, this is exactly what we would expect given the principle of alternative possibilities. If you're morally responsible, then you had alternative possibilities. So let's keep going. Let's change it up a little bit. Jones II is a reasonable person, but so he can be impressed by new reasons to change his mind. He walks into the store thinking he's going to steal a candy bar. And somebody comes up, says, I'm going to shoot you in the head if you don't steal the candy bar. Imagine the threat's even more impressive. I'm going to shoot you in the head, but before I do that, I know where your family lives, and I'm going to torture them unless you steal this candy bar. Jones II is so overwhelmed by the threat that he completely forgets what he was even doing in the store in the first place and just thinks, oh, what do I have to do to save my family and to not get shot? Like anything, I'll do it. So Jones II goes on to steal the candy bar. The only thing that made him steal the candy bar was this threat. He was going to do it, but what ended up doing, he completely forgot his original desire and is going to steal the candy bar only because of the threat. Now, is Jones II morally responsible for stealing the candy bar? Frankfurt wants to say no. And this makes sense. Why? Because Jones II was coerced into stealing the candy bar. The only reason he did it is because of this crazy threat, right? Did Jones II have alternative possibilities? In other words, is there any way he's getting out of that store not stealing the candy bar? Well, not with that threat, right? So he did not have alternative possibilities, and he's not morally responsible. Now, note again, this is exactly what we would expect given the principle of alternative possibilities. You're morally responsible when you have alternative possibilities. You're not when you don't have alternative possibilities. So far, as we would expect. The Jones III case is where things start getting interesting. Jones III is the kind of person who can be affected by threats, but he's also sort of the person who generally does what he wants to do. Imagine Jones III walks into the store, decides he's going to steal a candy bar, then somebody comes up to him and says, I'm going to shoot you in the head if you don't steal a candy bar. And Jones III thinks, oh, wow, that's really weird. I was actually just planning to steal the candy bar. So I'm going to just continue to steal the candy bar because I wanted to. But if I didn't want to steal the candy bar, then yeah, this threat would definitely make me do it. Like, there's no way I'm getting out of this store without stealing the candy bar. But the reason I'm going to steal it is just because I want to steal it. That's what's making me do it. So now with this case, note the way I presented it. Jones III is saying and thinking, I'm doing this because I want to. But if I didn't want to, then I would still end up doing it because of the threat. The threat would coerce me then. But it's not coercing me. I'm doing it because I want to. So note, either way, whether he wants to or doesn't want to, Jones is stealing the candy bar. So does he have alternative possibilities? Frankfurt says no. Is Jones III morally responsible for stealing the candy bar? Well, what made him steal the candy bar is just that he wanted to steal the candy bar. Again, it's almost as if the threat didn't happen. So is he morally responsible for his behavior? Yes. And here's the magic. We have somebody who didn't have alternative possibilities. If he wanted to steal the candy bar, he would. If he didn't want to steal the candy bar, he would, because the threat would make him. And yet he's morally responsible because what actually led him to steal the candy bar was his desire and not the threat. So, a case where the if part, the moral responsibility, you could put it that way, is true, but the then part, alternative possibilities, is false. So counterexample, or if you want to put it the other way, if you don't have if you don't have alternative possibilities, then you're not morally responsible for what you do. The first part is true, not having alternative possibilities, but then the second part is false, not being morally responsible. He is morally responsible. All right, but maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, yeah, Jones III sort of doesn't have alternative possibilities, but if he really wanted to, he could go against the threat and get out of that store, or not get out of the store without stealing the candy bar, but he could just say, no, I'm getting shot, right? So maybe in a sense he has alternative possibilities. So now Frankfurt's going to bring out his big gun case. And I'm going to switch some of the details just a little bit. Imagine Jones IV. He's a reasonable person. He can be impressed by threats, right? One day, he decides he's going to go into a store and steal a candy bar. Unbeknownst to him, there's somebody watching him from a security camera in the store. And the person watching him is actually Darth Vader. And Darth Vader, if you're familiar with the Star Wars movies, has force powers, right? So he can suggest courses of action and make people do them, right? Imagine Darth Vader is at that store and he's decided that Jones IV is stealing a candy bar. And Darth Vader thinks, if I see for a second that Jones IV is not going to steal the candy bar, then I'm going to go out there and use my force powers and I'm going to just flat out make him steal the candy bar. There is no way Jones IV is walking out of here without stealing a candy bar. And imagine Jones the Fourth never shows any signs of not wanting to steal the candy bar. In fact, he walks into the store with a desire to steal the candy bar. He goes in and does it. Darth Vader never has to show himself, right? Now, here's a possibility where I think if anybody's morally responsible for anything, then Jones the Fourth is morally responsible, right? Because what made him steal the candy bar? Just the fact that he wanted to steal the candy bar. The threat didn't even happen, right? But then we ask ourselves, is there any way that Jones the Fourth gets out of that store without stealing the candy bar? And the answer is no. Jones the Fourth is not one to take. He can't take on Darth Vader. He's just a regular guy, right? So now look at what we've said. Somebody can be morally responsible for their action even if they have no alternative possibilities whatsoever, even if their action is completely determined. So, what's the upshot? Why is this so important? Remember, the only reason we've been worried about determinism being a threat to free will is because we thought it ruled out somebody having alternative possibilities. Now we know alternative possibilities are not necessary for free will and moral responsibility, so we need not be worried about the threat of determinism. Why? Well, Frankfurt just proved it to us. You can be freely, act freely with complete control over your behavior, and be morally responsible for your action, and still not have alternative possibilities, right? So you can do that even if you don't have alternative possibilities. So that's it. That's the magic, right? Now, another takeaway that Frankfurt goes into here, what would excuse someone from moral responsibility? If it's not just that they don't have, if not having alternative possibilities doesn't rule out moral responsibility and free will, then what might? Well, here's something we know from his analysis. If somebody says, I could not do otherwise than I did, so I'm not morally responsible for my action, that's not a good excuse, because somebody can be morally responsible even if they could not do otherwise. In what circumstances? If their desire led to their action, right? And Frankfurt in another piece will build on other necessary conditions for free will. He'll talk about second order desires, a desire to desire something. But Frankfurt's in this piece has opened up the possibility that somebody could be morally responsible even if they could not do otherwise than they did. So he considers maybe a better excuse. A better excuse would be, I did what I did because I could not do otherwise. Note that in the Frankfurt cases, except for case 2, in Jones the First, Jones the Third, and Jones the Fourth, all those Joneses did what they did because they wanted to. They didn't do what they did because they couldn't do otherwise. It was only Jones the Second who did what he did because he could not do otherwise, because he was threatened, right? But imagine it's like this. Imagine somebody said to you, somebody who you thought was a good friend. They said to you, they walked up to you at your house and just slapped you across the face as hard as they could. And imagine they said to you, they told you the story afterwards, like you were outraged, and they said, "Look, somebody actually threatened me. They said that they had evidence that could get me fired from my job if I didn't just walk up and slap you in the face. So that's why I slapped you in the face." Imagine they then told you, "But this is also true. I've wanted to slap you in the face for so long. I've just been itching to slap you in the face. And you know what? Now that this happened, I mean, the only reason I did it was because I couldn't do otherwise, or the reason I did it was because I could not do otherwise. But also I want to. So yeah, there's that. You might initially be ready to let them off the hook, but then when you heard that last part, you'd be like, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm not letting you off the hook for that. We got some issues we got to hash out, or you got to leave, right?" So, what would be a legitimate excuse? Imagine the person said, who just slapped you in the face, they said, the only reason I did this is because somebody said they'd get me fired from my job, and I can't have that. Like, I'm, I'm breadwinner for my family, right? And I was thinking about my kids. I would never slap you in the face. The only reason I did this is because I could not do otherwise. Now, that would be a legitimate excuse, Frankfurt says. Um, Now, note, that is not an excuse that comes from determinism. Um, Determinism, well, somebody would still have an excuse if what determined their action was something like Ayer talked about, like an overwhelming compulsion that makes it so even if people want not to do something, the compulsion overwhelms them, or somebody coercing them to do something um, that would be in line with this sort of excuse. But determinism isn't going to rule out moral responsibility in cases where determinism worked through somebody's desires and their deliberation, right? So if somebody decides because of reasons that are determined that they want to do something and then do it, then they can still be morally responsible for their action. All right, so where have we been with Frankfurt? Frankfurt set out promising to have a counterexample to the principle of alternative possibilities. That counterexample would be a case where somebody was morally responsible for their action, even though they did not have alternative possibilities. And he showed it by Jones the Third. And if you didn't believe him with Jones the Third, then Jones the Fourth. Somebody who did something because they wanted to, and a threat that would have made them do otherwise either had no force or didn't even materialize, right? And why does that make it so that we don't have to worry about determinism as a threat to free will? The reason we were worried about determinism is because it seemed to rule out alternative possibilities. But it turns out we don't need alternative possibilities for free will and moral responsibility. And that's the magic. All right, so now on to some quiz questions. Before Frankfurt, why was determinism thought to possibly undermine free will? A, it might rule out the possibility that someone might have alternative possibilities. B, it might lead to a sense of hopelessness and resignation. Or C, it might cause us to do things we wouldn't want to do. Before Frankfurt, why was determinism thought to possibly undermine free will? If you're looking for the answer to that, it was just in the summary I gave and also at the beginning of the video. Quiz question number 2. Which of the following could be a counterexample to the principle of alternative possibilities? Someone who could have done otherwise and was morally responsible for their action. Someone who could have done otherwise but was not morally responsible for their action. Or C, someone who could not have done otherwise but was still morally responsible for their action. Which of those would be a counterexample to the principle? And finally, quiz question 3, which of the following would be a good excuse if it were true, according to Frankfurt? A, I could not do otherwise than I did. B, I did what I did because I could not do otherwise. Or C, I did what I did only because I could not do otherwise. Which of those would be a good excuse? If you're looking for that, it's towards the end of this video. All right, thanks for sticking with me. So concludes our section on free will. I hope you enjoyed it. And this progression is sort of the progression I went through with free will. I was actually maybe a libertarian about free will first, but then pretty soon after that convinced to be a hard determinism. but in graduate school was convinced to become a compatibilist because of articles like Ayer and especially Frankfurt. This one just did the trick for me. I wonder if it did for you. Uh, Anyways, thanks for sticking with me again. I'll see you next time.